conference. As you can hear, we are recording the session and it will be shared on CTL's YouTube channel afterwards. Just a few logistics before we go into the session itself. The first thing is, if you have any questions for the speakers, feel free to put them in the chat. It gets quite active, so you can have your own conversations in there, but if you're asking a question for a particular speaker, please, it's helpful to just tag them as a speaker. And Parama is our chat chair today, and she will share them with me so I can organize them. Each of our speakers, so this session, session 2, is on optimizing feedback to engage students, and we have 4 papers. So Margaret and Lavinia will be going first, and then Arpita, and then Courtney, who's presenting on herself for herself and Jennifer, and then we have Yana and Panos, who are presenting the final paper. Each speaker has 12 minutes, and we're going to let them talk through without interruption. If there are kind of clarification questions, I will ask them after each presentation, and then we should have a good 35 minutes for wider Q&A at the end of their presentations. We are going to have a break between this session and session 3, which is on Gen AI. So I'm aiming to finish about 25 past the hour, give you a 5-minute comfort break, and then we will start the next one at 16:30 to me, and it's probably 10:30, something like that for East Coast, and any other time zone that you're in, you will have to work out for yourself. The final session of the day is our networking mixer, which is at 6 p.m. London time, where I will be talking for about 3 minutes to give you an update on the teaching track project, which Jennifer, Christian, I, and several other people, so definitely a exercise in collaborative cross-institutional research, but mainly just to get your thoughts on what you might like people to be talking about going forward in that domain as well, but also an opportunity for people to go into breakout rooms and catch up with each other, either on the feedback topic or on the Gen AI topic, or indeed on the interaction between the two. Which is quite an interesting space as well. I think they're all the public announcements or housekeeping. I'm going to invite Margaret and Lavinia to start their presentation. And as I said, any questions, put them in the chat. Margaret, if you let me know when you're ready, I can start the timer.
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. See your slides and you're all ready to go.
Oh, except I'm not on the first one. Just a quick shout out to Lavinia, who's here, and she'll be taking some of your questions in the chat, but you'll be hearing from me for the presentation. Really pleased to be here to present some work in progress that Lavinia and I have been working on recently. Title of our project is The Impact of Performance Feedback on Student Study Habits and Grades. A little bit of background to set the stage. We all know that academic feedback can be really useful, and ideally it helps students achieve their full potential. In practice, however, far too often everyone hates feedback. Staff hate writing it, and students hate receiving it, and they also hate not receiving it based on the NNSS. They don't like anything about it, and it's an area where I think we regularly, as teaching staff, feel that we could do better and wonder about how. So in this study, we try to answer the question, does the framing of feedback affect how students respond to it? Our approach to answering this question is that we randomize the framing of an element of feedback that's shared to students at the start of revision period. I'll give you a bit more about the context in a moment. Based on this framing, we are going to track engagement during revision period, also a subset of that, which is engagement with material made salient in that feedback, and ultimately final exam performance. So a bit about the context. Our context is a UK context, so it'll be very familiar to some of you and not so much to others. But to give you a flavor, We'll be presenting data from a large first-year economics module. Large in this context is about 420 students. It's an in-person module that doesn't have specific online teaching, although we use the online virtual learning platforms that many of you will be familiar with. The 50% of the module is evaluated through a final exam and 50% through coursework, and half of that coursework is coming from weekly online quizzes. These are released in Moodle, and there's 9 quizzes, so each contributes a bit less than 3% of the final grade. Those of you who are familiar with Moodle will know that Moodle presents the quiz grades to students, and so in theory, students know their final quiz grade, but often there's a little bit of uncertainty about that due to, well, the first quiz, it was a bonus quiz, so it doesn't count, but it does show up in their average. Sometimes there's little corrections to be made as they go along. If they miss a quiz, it's a 0, but Moodle will give them, will just omit it. So there's some uncertainty about the final grade. Normally, this quiz grade is confirmed when final grades are released. That would be, you know, after the final exam, sometimes earlier. In the past, it had been sort of whenever convenient for you. It wasn't seen as a kind of a special moment. Most students were fine with that, although sometimes they would ask. We changed this setting with the following in the following way. We introduce a formal element of feedback, which confirms the final quiz grade at the start of revision period. So here in St. Andrews, we have, at least in that semester, we had 10 teaching weeks, 11 teaching weeks, 10 teaching weeks, which are followed by 1 week of revision before exam period started. The exam for this module was quite early in the exam period, so revision week was about almost exactly a week and 2 weekends. So you can think of it, the start of revision week, Monday morning, we release we confirm the final grade, we release feedback with that. In addition to confirming the final grade, which they approximately already know, we include an additional element of individualized feedback on quiz performance. So this identifies the unit of the textbook on which that particular student performed least well across the quizzes. And again, they know how they did on each question, but they probably haven't computed it in this way. So this is, it's not new, but it's new. It's sort of making salient this particular unit. And then there was 7 or 8 units that we covered in the module. So we experimentally vary. Everyone got the same content of feedback. What we vary is how it is framed or not framed. So our first version is a direct, sort of no framing. And an example of that is your final quiz score is X. Of those quizzes you submitted, your quiz score was lower in unit Y relative to other units. Our second version was a friendly opener, which we kind of framed this with a positive but generic statement, which was congratulations on finishing the semester. And then they got that same piece of feedback. The third version was what we call the individualized friendly opener. We said something positive at the beginning, but it varied depending on how many quizzes they had completed. So this is a slightly personalized element. So congratulations on completing X out of 9 quizzes. Everyone got the congratulations, even those few who didn't do very many of them, but there were very few who did very few. So 7 out of 9 quizzes was great work. 8 out of 9 was excellent. 9 out of 9 was perfect. It was all sort of positive things. And I think below great work, we said good effort, and everyone got good effort. And they had the same feedback. I've told you what outcomes we're going to be looking at. I won't talk too long about the data collection, but just to say that there was no primary data collection. We didn't run any surveys. We gathered administrative data from online platforms. We used Moodle, Panopto for lecture recordings. This is recordings of lectures that were done live. Students could go back and look at. Some attendance records, grades, some demographic and program data from their student records. We also have if and when they actually viewed the feedback that we released for them. That wasn't on Moodle, but it was in another platform. And all this was anonymized for us for research use by the university data team. So we're interested in study patterns and academic outcomes, and particularly whether the way this feedback is framed affects how students take action on it. Lots of different outcomes to look at, and anyone who's worked with this data before can appreciate how rich and complicated it is. Today, I'm going to present you results on 3 kind of aggregated outcomes, 2 engagement ones. So this is engagement during revision period, starting Monday morning of this revision period, after the feedback has been released. So the first is a standardized index of engagement with different platforms, and that's covering Moodle and Panopto, both the lecture viewing and also engaging with different things that they have on Moodle they can look at. The second one is the same, it's a subset of that measure focused on elements related specifically to the unit we identified as their lowest performing. So that includes lectures related to that unit, revision quizzes related to that unit, lecture slides, or sort of tutorial questions they might go back and look at related to that unit specifically. Finally, we look at exam grades, and here I'm just going to present the overall exam grade on the final exam. So we estimate the effect of the feedback through a very standard regression analysis because of our randomization and fairly large sample size. That's fairly straightforward. Choice of control variables matters. Lots of possible controls we can use here. I'm going to present you 4 specifications, one with absolutely no controls, 2 with sort of no controls, but restricted to those students who access their feedback. And I'm going to focus on those results. We had the majority did access the feedback, but those who never saw it aren't going to be treated by it. And so we're going to leave those out for most of what I show you today. Then basic student controls. And then finally, our preferred specification would be the detailed controls, which includes a lot of our engagement measures generated for the period, like during the module, as well as a bunch of coursework and so on, grades coming in. All right, quickly to look at our results. Here, what I'm presenting is a table where the outcome is this index of engagement, and it's standardized. So all of these are in standardized sort of standard deviation measures, and all of these are compared to the plain feedback where there was no friendly framing, either personalized or not. And the first row is the treatment arm, where is the friendly generic feedback. Congratulations, you completed the semester. The second one is the friendly individual feedback, where we said, you completed 9 out of 10, 9 out of 9 quizzes. Great job. And then they got their feedback. So an interesting and somewhat surprising to us pattern is emerging here, where across all of our different specifications, you'll see that this friendly generic feedback is actually reducing engagement during revision period by a not trivial 0.2 or a quarter of a standard deviation of effort. So these students who got the congratulations on finishing the semester are they're clicking on less stuff. This is mostly clicks on stuff. Some of it is duration if they're watching lecture videos, but a lot of it is going to be clicks-based. They're engaging less. Those who got the more personalized, one that might draw attention to the fact that we see them as an individual, we're not just giving them generic friendly feedback. None of those effects are statistically significantly different from not framing the feedback at all, but they are positive in sign. So we see a difference in sign with the friendly generic, but no difference no statistically significant difference with our baseline group. If we look at engagement with the worst unit, we see almost identical pattern, though we lose a bit of significance in the first row. But the magnitude of the effects is very similar, and the trend across the 2 treatment arms is very similar. So all this is suggesting that what we thought were 2 kind of flavors of kind of encouraging feedback are actually being perceived by students in quite different ways, actually in opposite ways, with respect to no framing at all. And I think I'll be very interested in your thoughts on whether this is, to what extent this is bad news or not. One thing that might be happening is that students are feeling less panicky and they're rushing and clicking on less things. So that's why our real outcome is, how does this affect the final exam grade? Because just a lot of activity in revision week is not necessarily something that translates into better learning outcomes. So here we're looking at the overall final exam grade. This isn't just focused on their worst unit. This is just looking at across the board. Here we see really no statistically significant differences across any of our treatment groups. We see some of the negative sign in the friendly generic treatment that we've seen at in the engagement outcomes, but none of them are statistically significant, and they're quite small. In our preferred specification, actually, the sign switches, and it's still not statistically different from 0, but if you want to say there's certainly no evidence that it harmed students. We see a somewhat larger positive, but again, not statistically significant effect from our sort of friendly individual feedback there. So the students engaged much less, but it didn't affect their final exam performance. briefly, our next steps, we have data collection for the project is ongoing. We've replicated the study in 2 modules of spring 2024. We're just waiting for the data to come through on that. We plan to run it again next year in the same setting as I've just presented. And kind of our big questions going forward are, why such differences between the positive framing styles? That's not something we had expected. We were kind of expecting one might be more effective than the other, but not in different directions. And again, with larger samples, will more systematic effects appear? So is some of this coming from an anomaly of that particular module?
Lovely timing, Margaret. Thank you very much. Lots of questions coming in the chat. I was going to ask a few sort of clarification questions about the organization of it. One is from me around, when you say a revision period, does that mean all classes and office hours and stuff are finished, so the only engagement points are with online materials?
Office hours are ongoing, but it's just a couple of hours in the week, so yeah.
Okay, and did the way that people responded to the feedback vary depending on whether they got 80% in their quizzes or 60% in their quizzes?
We haven't, I don't have those results to mind. We are controlling for that, but that's a good question. We haven't looked at heterogeneity by that specifically. I have some stuff on gender that we can come back to in the discussion period if we have time.
Yeah, I just, so anecdotally, some of my experiences, if you see that you've got 80, you think you're grand, and
Yeah.
you proceed. But some people see they got 80 and think they're doing terribly. So it's not variation. Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to hand over to Arpita, who hopefully can share her slides, and we'll pick up all your other questions either in the chat or we will ask them at the end. You let me know when you're ready to go, Arpita, and I'll start the timer.
Yeah, I am.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone for being here. This is a project that I have been, trying to work on. It's kind of a year into it, and it's kind of work in progress. Happy to listen to any comments that you have. So I'm going to kind of quickly give you what am I going to talk about. There is a little bit of a motivation behind the fact that I started teaching around COVID-19, and a lot of us were using Mentimeter, and I wanted to see whether or not that changes how inclusive our classrooms are. I'm going to probably skip the current literature and talk a little bit about what data do I use and what are the potential implications on that, and what am I thinking to do going forward. So in general, we know that any survey answers are generally come from people that actually care about answering those surveys, right? And we would like to bring in those people that actually do not participate in these types of surveys or any types of Mentimeter or any other student response systems. The problem is that we can't really do something about it. So this one doesn't really look into how to bring in those students into the fold, but I wanted to understand how student engagement and interactions changes when we use Mentimeter in the classroom. There is a lot of literature around that, a lot of it about understanding their performances and whether or not they are performing without any answer and anxiety as well. And of course, this also gives everybody a voice because it is largely anonymous unless, because we can set Mentimeter questions to be anonymous. However, it can also be the case that this is quite, it can bring in some sort of a fatigue, because if everybody is using Mentimeter, it kind of can become a little bit boring, so to speak. I'm going to rush through the literature because of the time constraints, but there are plenty of literature around these, especially when the couple of literature strands that are very interesting are where females are shown to be performing worse than males when these are they actually answer MCQs in time testing. Also, non-game based audience response systems can actually make students more comfortable in participating in the classrooms. And of course, there are other different techniques that we all use, and trying to understand whether or not when we use time limited tests, are those more inclusive or less inclusive. This was mainly the reason why I thought of doing this. So what are the objectives, so to speak? I wanted to understand how do students who engage with Mentimeters in the first place, how do they perform? Are these students tenacious? Are they actually going ahead and doing all these quizzes in the classrooms? And if there are any gender-specific patterns to those that performance that we are seeing. So the background of this data collection is that I led two first-year courses in 2022 and 23. These are first-year courses, so no prerequisites at all. I will have one more year of module 1 data. So there are module 1 and module 2. So I did not lead module 2 in the next year, so I don't have data for that, but I do have for module 1. And what I did is in the classroom, in the small group seminars, I introduced two types of MCQs over Menti. One was timed and one was untimed. In the timed one, much the same way that Clodagh has now the timer, students could see that timer was going down, so to speak. And I asked one personal questions, which was optional. They could skip it. It's about gender identity, whether or not they associate themselves with a particular gender, male, female, non-binary, or prefer not to say. These questions did not contribute to summative assessments. They were only done in tutorials. And we had 4 different educators in this year, 2 new tutors and 1 module lead, which was me, and another lecturer. I do not have actual attendance data. In Exeter, we do not track attendance. I do have expected attendance, how many students were actually enrolled in particular tutorials, but I don't have how many students actually attended these seminars. So for example, let's say in week 3 of module 1, approximately 37% less people actually answered Menti. So I don't really know how many students actually were attending these classes. So what did they actually see when they started answering this question? They understood that these were anonymous. This has nothing to do with their grades. They do not have to disclose the information on their gender identity. They can just skip the question as well. And that this is because there will be some sort of research that will get done with these data. And this is the only demographic question that I had asked, nothing more than that. I did not show them the results, they were hidden. So the main outcomes that we looked at was on performance, basically how many correct answers each student gave over the number of questions that were asked. And tenacity, number of questions they attempted over the number of questions they asked. So these were the main 2 outcomes that I was interested in. So the total observations was 631 for me. Some people did not, of course, answer the gender question, so 96 observations were dropped. Some people said prefer not to say, they were dropped as well. Non-binary numbers were very, very low, so I also dropped those. So finally, I ended up with 501 observations over these 2 modules as well. Now, in terms of the modules, there are 2 key differences across. One is that module 2 was slightly more quantitative in nature than module 1, and module 2 had bi-weekly seminars and module 1 had weekly seminars. So that was the key difference between these 2 modules. And of course, as we know, in general, over weeks, participant numbers starts dropping because attendance start dropping, and that we see across both the modules as well. So what do we see in this data? What we see is that on aggregate, the distribution doesn't really change very much across timed and untimed MCQs. The averages, of course, in timed MCQs are slightly lower than the untimed MCQ performances. And if we see by gender identity, what we see is that female, so again, the overall distributions do not change a lot, but females are probably slightly, on average, performing slightly better than males, especially when we're thinking about untimed quizzes in both modules. In terms of tenacity, as if I might remind you, the tenacity was number of questions attempted over number of questions that was there. So in tenacity, also we don't see very much differences. They generally tend to answer 8 out of 10 questions overall, more or less, but of course there are outliers around it. And across gender identity, we do not see something very different. Probably males in untimed quizzes slightly, the average is slightly lower than females over both the modules. And if we do that by modules, and again, we kind of see a similar pattern in untimed quizzes. Again, the average for males is slightly lower than the rest overall. And because we had this scheme in Exeter in which there were economics scholars, we call them economic scholars. These are exceptional third-year students who do some of the tutorials of first-year courses. I wanted to see whether or not there are any gender differences in tenacity when the tutors are closer to the age groups of the students, because it is kind of probably visible for them. Probably it shows for females are slightly more tenacious than male on the average. Again, the distribution doesn't seem to change quite a lot than when they're faced with lecturers or module lead. In terms of correlates, one thing that comes up, at least from this analysis, is that females are not necessarily performing worse in timed MCQs, no matter how we look at this. Of course, in timed MCQ, students perform slightly lower than in untimed quizzes. Of course, they are getting more time, they're likely scenario less stressed, etc. But females do not perform much worse than males in these kind of situations. So that doesn't actually track with the literature. It's kind of slightly at odds with what the literature largely says. In terms of tenacity as well, there is no differences for females in timed quizzes as well. So that's another something to keep in mind. I also included timing of tutorial because in Exeter, oftentimes I hear quite a lot of complaints about either the tutorial is too early in the morning at 8:30 or too late in the evening at 5:30. That doesn't seem to change quite a lot because that was one for these odd times of tutorials. That doesn't seem to change quite a lot, no matter in performances or in tenacity. And then lastly, what I wanted to see is that about quitting. So how I defined quitting, and it is kind of a work in progress on how I am going to call it finally. If a participant stopped attempting 2 or more consecutive questions from the end or did not even start, I have termed them as students who weren't enthusiastic enough about the Mentimeter quizzes, and they didn't kind of care enough to finish the quiz. What we see is that across male or female, it doesn't seem to kind of differ quite a lot. The number of quitters in a sense are kind of quite similar in number, so to speak. So in terms of future steps, what I want to do is, first of all, I have a proxy for attendance in terms of expected attendance, and probably I'm going to use that as a control in some specifications, not always, because of course it's going to be endogenous in terms of how many number of participants I have. And also I'm going to have the module 1 data from year 2. I had 5 economics scholars that next year, and all the tutorials were taken by them. These the number of students have actually more than doubled from the first year. So in that sense, it is quite a lot of data work. An RA is currently working through that. So hopefully I'm going to have that data very soon. And hopefully I'm going to be able to use that and make sure that the results that I'm finding actually holds or not for the next year as well. So yeah, any suggestions, questions, and comments are highly welcome. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Arpita. Quick clarification question from Doug around, I guess, what you mean by untimed quizzes as opposed to timed quizzes. So untimed sounds like they're never ending, I guess. Is there?
No, so the tutors were given an instruction that they should wait a little bit. So if they could always see how many students are there they have joined the quiz, so to speak. So kind of when it reached that everybody had answered more or less, then they would kind of move on to the next question. So that's in the sense that it would have been probably a minute maximum by which everybody would have answered all the questions. So that was the untimed bit. The timed ones generally had 30 seconds of timers.
Okay.
Not generally, and always had 30 seconds of timers.
Perfect. So there's a real constraint and a implicit constraint in these things. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass over to Courtney next.
All right, great. Just let me. Okay. So I'm happy to talk about how my colleague Jen and I, who is here on the chat as well, use cross-course assessments to align our students with our curriculum in our program. Okay, and the motivation for this is something along the lines of the following. Let's say you're teaching economics and you put up something like this demand function, or you're teaching econometrics and you put up something like this simple regression function, or you've got a too-good model and you put up a budget constraint, and some disconnect is happening with your students. And when you really drill down to it, it is something fundamental missing. And what's happening is that we're missing this idea of what equation of the line is. Okay, and in order to understand the application here, we have to remember this. And so why does this happen? Is it because students are no longer taught things like the equation of lines? Or are they pretending that they've never been taught things like equation of lines? It could be that, but it probably is more that these fundamental skills are just forgettable. And actually, it takes a lot of practice to be able to apply something that you've learned before. Okay. And so what we need here is a bridge between this. So we need an explicit bridge, taking these things we've learned before and a practice applying them in varied settings. Okay, and so this is the idea that we have. We want to create a bridge. We don't want to just do it for equations of the lines. We want to do it specifically for the things that we want to build on in our courses from our prerequisites. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about here today, is how we bridge our prerequisite concepts in our program. Okay, and so the idea here is a bridging quiz. And this is a checkpoint quiz between courses. So given as a capstone in a prerequisite course or as a warm-up in a downstream course. And really it's serving two groups, instructors and learners. And so when we think about what we as instructors want, what we want is to hold students accountable for their prerequisite concepts. So without using a lot of instructional time, we don't want to reteach the stuff. Okay, so what we want is students to interleave concepts across courses, okay, at the program level. All right, now what do learners want? Learners want some help doing this. They want help to recognize and recall those fundamental skills required. And this is alignment. So in order to recall a fundamental skill, you have to be first taught it. So we need alignment across our courses. But students also need some practice and guidance on integrating these skills and closing these existing skill gaps. And this is where feedback between instructors and learners is really important. Okay. And this should be at the individualized to the student. So the student is getting a sense of where, particularly for them, where their skill gaps exist. So how can a bridging quiz help with this? Well, you can base questions on your program-specific prerequisite skills as they're required downstream. And so what this does is the quiz design itself is explicitly mapping curriculum. So this is where alignment comes in. And the questions themselves are a message to students about what exactly is aligned. And so this is the feedback component, that we need this feedback between instructors and students. It's not enough that instructors know that their courses are aligned. We have to communicate this to students in a way that resonates with them. So we're going to talk today about how we do this along our econometric skill pathway at U of T. Okay, we have at U of T prerequisite courses that develop quantitative skills in second year. And then we have downstream economics courses at the third and fourth year level that require these foundational skills for empirical application and interpretation. Okay, and so we've designed a bridging quiz that's about 30 multiple choice questions, developed collaboratively with Jen and I. And our overall design principle in this was to design big picture questions that bridge second year prerequisite skills to their typical use in third and fourth year. Okay, we do this by using case studies from empirical economics to assess skill and applying those prerequisite learning to these cases. So tables, figures, text. Okay, we base these questions on intuition and big picture skills, so it doesn't require memorized formulas or calculators not typically needed in these questions. Okay, we do this with a 2-point delivery. So we have about 30 questions on a 90-minute clock with 1% participation-based grade weight in our courses. And we give it as a capstone at the end of our main second year prerequisite. So this course is called ECO 220. And the timing as a capstone is at the last week of term, but prior to the final. So students can help this as a study exercise to assess their readiness in taking the final exam. We also give it as a warm-up quiz at the start of 3 upper year courses. So there's ECO 372 and ECO 375, which are 2 different courses in advanced econometrics, and then ECO 402, which is a field course in health economics. Okay, all 3 of these courses have quantitative prerequisites, ECO 220, or other course equivalents, like from the stats program. Okay, the timing as a warm-up is really early in the term, so in week 2 of the term, and what this is doing is helping students assess their readiness to proceed with the course. Okay, now we do it at a 2-point delivery, but you could do it as a single point delivery, either on your own as a capstone or a warm-up. And of course, this requires less coordination across instructors. Now I want to give you a sense of how we design this quiz. So I'm going to give you one of the quiz questions, and this comes from an article published in the AAR called Screening and Selection, the Case of Mammograms. Okay, and so we have a host of questions on this case. This one is about figure 1, which is this. And the question is, why are the error bars not visible in the figure? Okay, and so then we have to look at the figure and see what's being measured here. So on the y-axis, we have the share of women who've had a mammogram, and we have this across age. And of course, the table notes are going to describe what's being measured. And so we have that, again, figure shows share of women who've had a mammogram by age. And all of these sentences are talking about what's being measured. At the end, we have error bars, small and therefore not visible in the figure, reflect 95% confidence intervals. And then n equals about 7 million observations. So right away, we're thinking, okay, this is a large sample size, and there's going to be a lot of precision in this data, and we're going to have small confidence intervals because of that, even if we divide up that 7 million across these age bins. Okay, and that's what the answer to the question is. So we give this as a multiple choice question. Here's the right answer, and then we have a bunch of options to distract them. Okay, and when you think about what you would want from students coming out of a course where they do statistical inference, is an understanding of what happens when n is large. Okay, and so this is sort of getting at that. Right, and so we have 32 questions that are like this, taking some general concept like confidence intervals and seeing how you can apply it in the wild. Okay. So I would love to show you a lot about quiz performance, but I probably only have time for about 3 key takeaways. The first is on overall performance, and that is that applying prerequisite skills to case studies is tough. Okay, so if you look back at here, you can have a student who is very good at calculating confidence intervals, knows the theory of confidence intervals, but this step of actually being able to understand what it means in a varied context is an extra step, and you need a lot of practice to do that. So for example, on this mammogram question, the average across all the times we've given this quiz is 33%, okay? So not 100%. The second thing we learned is something about program alignment. So the quiz performance in our downstream economics courses really differs by which prerequisite stream you come from, economics versus stats. So for example, in ECO 375, which is an advanced course in econometrics, the average is 16 percentage points lower for the students coming from the stats prereq. Okay, so this could be indicate some level of selection. It also could be that as our program has shifted towards data analytics and application in economics, it may mean there's this divergence now in these curriculum equivalencies. Okay, so our stats students are starting behind because they haven't had a lot of practice applying this economic questions as early as second year. The third is that this is a low-touch intervention for concept review. Okay, I'll give you an example from the health economics course, which has no direct instruction in methods and is generally students are less quantitatively minded who take this course. For instance, the performance on the week 2 warm-up on that mammogram question is 19% correct, which is a little worse than just guessing. Okay. The low touch intervention is students are provided the solutions to this quiz. They're told to review this and follow up on any areas of hesitancy. And we have resources in week 2 and 3 of the course to help them work through this. Okay, that mammogram paper is a course paper, but our primary focus in talking about it is on the contribution to health economics. Okay, even so, we put the mammogram question as a short answer on the final, And we found that 63% were getting that mostly or entirely correct. At the beginning of the course, 19% on a multiple choice exam were getting this correct. And so it means that these students were reviewing this to the extent that they're able, some of these students are now able to describe the answer to that question in their own words. Okay, now some of the barriers to implementing this is that it requires a lot of collaboration. First, at the design phase, where you have to sum up these learning outcomes across prerequisite courses, you need to design big picture questions to do this. It's also coordination at delivery. So instructors need to devote course time, grade weight, resources to implement the quiz. And it can be sort of uncomfortable. So instructors can worry that teaching and learning may be compared across instructors. It may highlight skill mismatches in the prerequisite pathway. So if you have this waterfall of cascading program goals and you've been privately thinking this about your colleagues, now you have to kind of say it out loud that there's this mismatch or this disagreement about what to teach. Okay, options then for successful implementation are to use existing team coordinated prereq courses that leverage existing structures for assessment coordination, and you just extend that to 30 big picture questions for the course. You might want to consider anonymizing the quiz or a process blinded to student identifiers, so you get around that comparison issue. It can be useful as a curriculum mapping exercise because it sparks discussion about measurable course skills, in addition to just course concepts and coverage. Like, how can we measure this? And then it can bring measurement to that mapping process. You can also consider one-sided adoption. So prerequisite instructors can develop their own capstone quiz bespoke to their big picture concepts and repeat year on year to capture skill changes. Or downstream instructors can design their own downstream warm-up quiz based on the prerequisite skills that they're going to build on in their course. And if you want to coordinate more tightly, you can look at questions that are based on previous term assessment. Okay, so 5 takeaways from this deck. If I were to summarize what I said, it's that the design process of this quiz is useful as an exercise in alignment, and it's tailored. So it's bespoke to the institutional setup, the program setting, and faculty skills that are at your institution. It's not a one size fits all. It provides useful measurement on student skills for instructors, and it also provides practice on individual information on skill proficiencies to students. Okay, it's an easy early term accountability exercise to do in downstream courses. And so if you wanted to start this process, you could start by defining 20 to 30 questions that aim to align skills from prerequisite courses. Okay, and so I hope I've given you some ideas for thinking about how to use a quiz like this to align within your program setting. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Courtney. Just a couple of clarification questions. One is how the quizzes affect final grades or how they come into final grades.
So the quiz itself is just a participation-based quiz, so they're not related in any way to final grades. And we didn't run an experiment, so there would be no way to see, you know, what the effect of doing this quiz on final grades. So we have no control.
And the other question was, were they in person or online, and how did you decide which to do?
So we started out online, and so in ECO 220, the quiz is done online. It's got a 1-week window, and it's on the 90-minute clock. In the upper year, 3rd and 4th year courses, it started out online in the tutorial period, but now it's in person on paper. So they're given 90 minutes in the tutorial, and then we collect the papers and machine grade them.
And what's the rationale behind the differences, or what?
So it was just moving forward in generative AI and the academic integrity. So if we do it in class, it's more locked down. You can kind of see there's also incentive to participate because we're all in the room together. And so that was why we switched.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah,
Thank you so
COVID,
much.
Jen says. That's right.
Yeah, COVID. Sounds to everything. COVID and Gen AI is the combined
Yeah.
answer to everything. Thank you so much. We have a few more questions, which we'll come back to in a little while. Our final talk is by Jana and Panos from Southampton, so I can hand over to them.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today, Panos and I are going to present a project that we worked on together with our colleague Emanuela Lotti, where we try to reduce student procrastination on a dissertation project. So looking at the literature, we know quite a bit that procrastination has a negative impact on student performance. So we know this isn't great for students. And when you dig into why students tend to procrastinate, we know that it's driven by feelings of anxiety over the task. So if they have tasks that make them anxious, tasks that are unfamiliar, that they're doing perhaps for the first time, and anything that has very long time frames is likely to generate a larger amount of procrastination behavior. And so we know it's negative. We kind of know why, what is driving it. So we look towards the behavioral literature to try and understand how we can help students address procrastination. And we find that there's a number of interventions that are potentially beneficial. One is task simplification. So taking large projects and breaking them down into smaller chunks might help students manage them better and spread the workload over the time period. And also timely feedback interventions. So students knowing that they are on track throughout that long-term assessment is also something that will help reduce procrastination. We also know that the two key preference parameters that impact student procrastination or people's procrastination are the preference parameters for time preference and risk aversion. And so we bring these on board in our study to try and understand how these are impacting student behavior. We focus on the dissertation project because this is a really good example of a project that's likely to generate procrastination behavior. It is a long-term project, a semester or a whole year-long project typically. It's quite unfamiliar. Students typically have not done something similar to the dissertation before they do it for the first time. And we know that it generates quite a bit of anxiety in our students. Anecdotally, we've also observed signs that students are procrastinating on this. We observe bunching of supervisory meetings towards the end of the time period. So students kind of wait too long to start that process. Sometimes even in terms of applying for ethics approval, if they need to do so, that's kind of left quite late in the day and creates administrative problems. And so we've kind of, it's a thing that we wanted to try and help students address. And so what we try to do with this project, we try to find out whether we can design an intervention that successfully improves student grades and reduces submission times, using a nudge that we apply a combination of a simplification mechanism and also a salience forward feedback nudge, we call a forward feedback nudge. And we also, through the measurement of time and risk preferences, look to see if there's any heterogeneity in that impact and whether these are driving any element of behavior that we're observing in our students. A little bit on the institutional context, really briefly, we're based at the University of Southampton, a selected Russell Group university in the south of the UK. We're focusing on our third year cohort at the time, and that was about 150 students who've been doing economics for the whole duration of their degree. And this in Southampton is a semester long research project, which is called the Dissertation Literature Review. So we split their dissertation into two modules. They do the literature review in semester one, and then they do the empirical analysis in semester two. That kind of gives us at least a midway where we mark their work and kind of touch base with us. What we do is we create two things. So first we create a simplification mechanism, this what we call a task list. So we designed this task list that spans the whole of the semester, and we kind of thought, what would an ideal student that spreads their workload out throughout the whole semester, what would they be doing every week in building their dissertation literature review? And so we call this a forward feedback design because the student, before having submitted any work, can check to see whether they're progressing at the right pace. And it gives them a lot of guidance in terms of assessing how far along they should be and versus where they are. This is made available to everyone. So it's the condition of our ethics approval that we've created something that is already an improvement from the baseline of what they would have had in another year, in a typical year. But then in addition, for our treatment group, we also administer a salience nudge where every week we remind them that there's this task list. We remind them of what they're meant to be doing in this week. And we try and we encourage them to interact and tick off tasks, because you can physically tick off that you've completed these tasks. on the task list. And this is all hosted on the virtual learning environment, or the LMS. If I kind of summarize the whole experimental design, before we do anything to the students, we elicit their preferences, so as uncontaminated as possible. And then so time preference, risk preference, cognitive reflection test, and self-reported procrastination, where they tell us whether they're procrastinators. We randomize into treatment and control groups using the virtual learning environment. We administer the nudges, the intervention over the semester. They submit their dissertations, they're marked, and then we collect the data. And Panos is going to present you with the data and the results.
Thanks, Jana. So we have data from the last academic year on the economics dissertation marks, and on an online test that they have to submit it at the beginning of the semester as part of the dissertation, with a 2 weeks window. And we know the time of the submission, and we use that as a proxy for procrastination. So basically, if the students have submitted in the first week of this 2 weeks window, they are considered as non-procrastinators. And if they have submitted in the second week, they are considered as procrastinators. We have data also on submission hours from the dissertation deadline, and we can control for dissertation supervisors, research topics, program of study, gender, and year 2 average, which we use it as a proxy for ability. And we have also data on how students were engaging with our task list, with the Blackboard page, and with the recordings of the lectures. And for those that were participating in the experiment, we have their risk and time preferences, CRT, a CR test, and their self-reported procrastination. So descriptively, what we find is a slightly negative relationship with of marks with submission time. In terms of how balanced is the sample between treatment and control group, it is indeed by gender, by year 2 average, and risk aversion. And there are slightly differences by present bias, 55%, 45%. What we are finding descriptively is that students that are nudged, so they are in the treated group, submit earlier and perform better in their dissertation. And the actual treatment, so students that are nudged and are using actively the task list are performing better and submit earlier their dissertation from all the other groups. An interesting result that we're finding is that students that are risk averse and are nudged perform better and submit earlier their dissertation. And in the next stage, we see whether these results stand empirically by controlling for students' characteristics. And we find that the nudging has no effect on grades or submission time. We believe that this is due to small sample size. However, nudging students increase the interaction with the task list. And what we find is that students that are engaging, that there is a positive correlation between students that are engaging with a task list and with their performance. The actual treatment, so students that are nudged and are using actively the task list is positively, they are positively correlated with performance. And procrastinators, as defined from the time of the submission of the online test, we find that they are performing worse from non-procrastinators by 5 points out of 100, by about 5 points out of 100. But we cannot predict with this measure, cannot predict time of the submission. What we find, interestingly, is that risk-averse students are submitting their dissertation earlier, and if they are nudged, they're submitting their dissertation even earlier from all the other students. And to conclude, I have 2 minutes, that's good. So in this project, what we are trying to do is to reduce how students are procrastinating in long type of assessment, like the dissertation, by creating a simplified forward feedback mechanism, which is the task list, followed by weekly nudges, by weekly emails. And we're trying to understand the impact of time and risk preferences on the students' submission time and grades. What we're finding is that actual procrastinators, as defined from the time of the submission of the online test, hurt students, is negatively correlated with grades. And however, what we are finding is that self-beliefs about procrastination is not a good measurement for actual procrastination. And this may imply that, for example, if a department wants to target procrastination by organizing drop-in session, this may not imply that they are targeting the right audience. And what we find also, what we see that if we want to implement a policy, we have to take into consideration that the heterogeneity between students. What we find also is that sending weekly emails work because it increases the engagement with a task list, and this is positively correlated with performance. And that there are concerns about more risk-averse students who will submit already earlier, and if they are nudged, this may be unnecessarily doing it. So what we suggest is that further research is needed to investigate how we tailor nudges specifically targeted to less risk-averse individuals to decrease their submission time. This is for us. Hopefully I am on time.
You are. You're
That's good.
perfect. Just before you unmute, Panos,
Yes.
you mentioned heterogeneity, and there was a question from Carlos about how similar are the students and if they've done similar modules and timetables. So I guess if their load in other ways is the same.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So are the students doing other modules that are the same, have the same timetables?
They don't. The dissertation is similar to the dissertation, you mean, or?
Well, just more, if you've got 20 students, are they doing 20 different other
topics?
things? Yeah. Well, no, in their other modules. So are they kind of have the same pressures on them at the same time?
They have assignments during the semester, but yeah, they do. The answer is they do.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Please keep the questions coming in the chat, or you can, if you don't have one for a specific speaker, but something's coming to your mind, let us know and we can ask those as well. Thank you to Lavinia and Yana. Having these two presenters here is very helpful for answering things in the chat. So we've covered off
Yes,
quite
it is.
a bit. Margaret Brahma had a question about collecting all the data from Moodle, and I guess whether there's a good centralized system that connects student records for you with Moodle data and even the Panopto data talking to the Moodle data, or was it a major manual headache? And sorry, Panos, do you want to stop sharing ones?
Yeah, great question. When I talked to the data people at the university, they were surprised that I managed to do this because I think it is a big headache. But it wasn't, so across our platforms, we have the student ID, we have their name, and we have their email. And at one point I did have to merge on names, which was a bit messy because they're stored in different ways in different platforms, but it's usually a handful that need to be resolved manually, at least in our setting, but they don't talk directly to each other. I had to make a key to kind of link them up.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, did you have to apply for any ethics when you were doing this study, and you went through all of that as well?
Yeah, it was a bit challenging. The university was quite keen, I mean, quite set on all students having the same educational experience, which makes running an experiment a bit tricky.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
Can I
live
ask
with
a
some-
quick follow-up question, Claudia?
of course, Carlos.
Well,
please do.
now you said that the data was anonymized by your ethics team, but you also say that you did the merging of the data yourself. So how did you do it? You got the data ready and then send it to them and they anonymized it?
Yes, that's how it works. So as a lecturer, I have access to all this data. And I, partly because it is quite a bit of work and not something I felt the planning team really should be doing if I have access to it anyway, I did that part for them, and then I sent it to them for pseudonymization, I guess they mask it. And it was only at that point that I could then share it with Lavinia to work on for research purposes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Arpita, a question for you, which I think you partly answered in the chat, but I think it would be good to give you an opportunity to speak to it, which is what incentives students have to engage with the mentees and to even to try to get them correct? when it
Yeah,
doesn't
so these are
land.
these are formative quizzes, so they know that this doesn't count towards their final grades. So what I did is in each lecture, I would kind of remind them that, this is a nice opportunity for them to go through the questions and understand where they are in terms of their whole understanding of the module and things like that, but nothing. And I also reminded them sometimes over the announcement part in Moodle, but nothing like an incentive to actually take part. They could have not taken part as well, I guess.
And were you trying to work out if they understood the question? Like, did it matter to you if they were trying to get them correct or not?
I mean, well, I guess that if they were, so the questions were uploaded almost a week ago, so they should have kind of attempted it and they were encouraged to do. So hopefully the reason that they would have wanted to do it is because they would kind of understand how far they have understood in terms of the content. I didn't care if they answered it right, so to speak, or they have it's more like, are they practicing and actually they're following things in the classroom? So I guess I don't have a clear answer to whether or not, what if they were always getting it wrong? I don't have, I mean, yeah, well, they will be part of it, part of the sample. If they didn't practice at all and they didn't understand anything, hopefully by just following it in the classroom, they would have understood. So that's the point. I didn't do anything to actually make them incentivized to actually answer correctly.
Excellent, thank you. I can see Emanuela is about to join us. Courtney, this is the big question for all of us, I think. So in the UK, we have a very modularized course system. So doing things across courses is quite difficult. So Parama had a question around how you get instructors to understand what concepts are really required upstream and downstream and how to make the connection. Obviously, you and Jen can sit down and do that. But if you were trying to get people who weren't as well intentioned as you and Jen, how might you try and get a program director to encourage people to do that?
So I think that's one of the most difficult things, is that it does require a lot of collaboration, and a lot of times academics are very good at collaborating, but also this is my own little island and I'm going to do what I want to do. So I think that one way to do that is, first of all, just to have a conversation about it and to get a sense of what kind of skills you're using downstream. So in a non-confrontational way, to start that. But one thing to do it alone would be to, if you're say in a downstream course, to look at the assessments that are being done in your prerequisite course. So if you can ask instructors, so can I see your final exam? And that'll give you, you can look at a syllabus and see the topics, but if you look at assessments, that tells you what students can actually do. So if you're looking at those assessments, it may give you an idea of, okay, this is how I can draw on that. This is something I use in my course. I can draw on these questions from prerequisite assessment and design some big picture question around it. And I think that's the most important point, is that the integration across the course for students is really important, so that they see that through line through their program.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that so we tend to share our BLE pages with each other, and I think a lot of people just go and look at the syllabus, and I think you're absolutely right. It's actually what they get assessed at the end can be the quite useful thing for you to understand. But also it feels like, I guess, the course coordinator or the program director in UK language may need to be the person trying to encourage people to do this as much as possible. So some kind of, what do we used to call it at UCL, the connected curriculum type of idea, that because it's not just econometrics 1 and econometrics 2, actually I teach micro, and what they're doing, what I do in micro affects what they're going to do in labor or what they're going to do in development as well. So actually,
Exactly.
some of us who teach the quite fundamental courses in the first year, you know, you want other people, you want to know what other people need you to teach, but also it's good to get the feedback from an upper year course to know these, you know, in my case, these students don't know how to profit maximize. And I'm like, I spent 3 weeks with them on that. How do they not? And, you know, it goes back to that point, well, they just haven't made the connection between what you're doing and what I did. And I think those
Yeah.
conversations.
And so it might be useful to make that connection really clear for them by taking what you do on profit maximization and redesigning a question that then they see again now in their 3rd year or their 2nd year. And I think that, like, thinking about standardized assessment that was suggested by Doug, which is really great to see about across institution. This is almost the opposite of that, which is to let's integrate really closely with what we are doing at our institution with our instructors, and how can I borrow, you know, what Clodagh's doing in that course and then trigger it again in my course downstream.
Yeah, really good. Jana and Panos, some discussion around that, I guess, is the dissertation compulsory, and also do they have a compulsory module beforehand? So have you got some indication of their base quality going into this module, and indeed whether they're procrastinators in other courses before they do the dissertation?
So we control for kind of a average, so we use average grades in their 2nd year as a control going into kind of their 3rd year for kind of student ability proxy. But we don't have a comparable module in the 2nd year, do we, Panos?
No, we don't. That we can compare it straight. No, we don't have it.
We've not carried out kind of any analysis with any 2nd year modules.
Yeah.
And is it compulsory, the dissertation, or optional?
It's core, actually. They have to pass it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you do have a good student group doing it.
Yes, yeah. They have to pass it to.
So there were also, just while we're talking about the dissertation, there's some debate in the chat about whether it's a bad thing to be submitting late, and what procrastination really is. Is it, you know, they could be working the whole way through, but you're not seeing it, if that makes sense. But also they may have other modules that they're working on, so it might just be an efficient allocation of their time, I guess.
I think we need to maybe distinguish between kind of late submissions, because you can procrastinate and not procrastinate and submit on time, right? So the procrastination is how you spread the workload up leading up to that submission. We measure dissertation submission times as another outcome variable, but that's not what we use as a measure of procrastination. That's just an outcome. But the evidence in the literature is quite clear that people that postpone all the work to the week before the deadline or the day before the deadline have lower grades on average. So the procrastination is detrimental. So leaving all the work to the end is detrimental to student grades. So that's quite well established.
I'm doing that. Thank you. So it's always trying to work out whether to go to the chat on my document.
And just to add that also, if students will submit earlier, they may have more time for revision in other modules. So this may also have a positive impact on their exams, because we see, for example, that students were submitting late and then they had to apply for special considerations because they didn't have time to revise, and this made things more complicated. So it might have also a positive impact in the following exams.
Do they get any, so I would think, I mean, I agree with that, that if it's genuinely done and you feel that you're ready to submit, submitting early is a good idea, but do they have the opportunity to check that with the supervisor or something like that, so that they're not submitting too early? And because, you know, sometimes with a dissertation, stepping away from it, doing something else and then coming back to it, you know, that reflection can be quite important between a 2-1 and a first often for people. So do they get that kind of advice?
Inside the checklist, the last few tasks at the end are of that nature, or like review, kind of spell check. It's all the stuff that you're meant to do after you've actually finished. So there is kind of our consideration that you should kind of have finished and then are revising or reviewing what you're going to submit in the last stages. So we factored in that kind of time in what we consider our ideal student performance. I don't know if there's anything else you think, Panos.
So we give general directions on how the students should write the dissertation, and a structure. But they don't, if Claudia, you're asking if they get feedback on drafts, they don't get feedback on
And
drafts.
it's risk aversion that's driving this, because we see, you know, what happens, kind of people are submitting when nudged if they're risk averse, submitting so much earlier. So it's really this maybe more of the worry that something might happen in the meantime and they might forget, or they might, you know, the technology might fail them and things like that. That might be the drivers. We haven't had the chance in this project to dig into really the driver of that, what's triggering the risk aversion, but it's definitely risk aversion that's driving it, not time preference, which was quite a surprising finding for us.
Yeah, I think it's what I call the worried well, that the people who are doing fine and they're still worried. Arpita and Courtney, there's some questions about the nature of the questions that you're asking in Arpita, in your case in Menti, and Courtney in terms of the bridging quizzes. So Arpita, from Doug, the questions you ask in the Menti are quite short. Do you think if you did them for longer or more challenging questions, where students maybe had to spend 5 or 10 minutes on them, do you think you might get different results?
So they were a mix of more conceptual questions and some questions where you had to work out the math, so to speak. So that is why one of the controls that I use in understanding the correlates were whether or not there are quantitative questions. So where you had to do like literally 2 lines of math. It's not a very very detailed type of maths. These are first year courses, so nothing is extremely complicated. Well, probably for us, it is not generally very complicated. So if they had kind of followed the lecture and content, and they are encouraged actually to attempt these questions before coming to the class. So hopefully they have had looked at it, but we all know that they don't generally. So they wouldn't have needed like 5 to 10 minutes on average, but if they were well aware of the content, so to speak, maybe they would have needed a minute. And I do see that in the quantitative questions, they perform slightly worse than the non-quantitative questions. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And Courtney, it's kind of a similar question for you around, I guess, the mammogram paper. And so you do a lot of sort of interpreting and application, but is there a need to actually ask questions just whether people can compute things like confidence intervals, or are the things that you want to make sure they understand going into the next course around the application of the concepts?
So it tends to be around the application. So when we're looking at our 3rd and 4th year courses and we're seeing what students were being asked to do in those courses, really it's a lot of, there's a reading list, here's some articles, and we have to read and understand those articles. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we integrate those basics from prereqs into understanding what's going on in the table, understanding what's going on in the figure. So we are specifically trying to target that application, just because of our program needs, they tend to center around a lot of empirics. We have a data analysis focus where our students are asked to then go on and work with data and produce their own papers and their own results. And so really an understanding, like if you go back to the mammogram paper, having a sample size of that big, the idea that it would mean that your confidence intervals are small, your standard errors are small, is something a practitioner would know. And it's something that when you're doing data work, you can anticipate if you've got a large sample size, what it's going to mean for your confidence intervals. And that's something that is a high level up from just being able to calculate it. And so the prereq course is about how to calculate those things. And so we're focusing more on the things that we need for our program in the third year, fourth year, which is to be able to use this in practice. So in that sense, it's really specific to our programming needs. And I think that's why it has resonance for students. So you can see that that mammogram question was something that we actually did in the health economics course. So they're seeing the integrated prereq skills, then also what can we understand from this paper in terms of the topic health economics. So we're making that leap across those courses.
Yeah, and just to clarify, at our second year econ courses, we actually do the interpretation, reading the figures, tables, like those are skills that we're trying to build in. And but they're not getting that if they're kind of going through the statistics department, and it's a big challenge. And this kind of lays that bare as a big challenge, that students they can do calculations galore, but they have no idea what any of it means.
So you very nicely identified where your gap is, and that's what you're trying to test. Thank you. I had a general question for anyone, and I think it's around, so with the nudges, the bridging quiz, the mentees, we all know that students want feedback as soon as possible, but we also want to make sure that they're getting useful feedback. And I was just wondering, in terms of when you give them the feedback or how you design, making it short, how you try to manage that trade-off between quality feedback or quality nudges and getting it to them as quick as possible. Peter, I think you were the one who made me think about it, if you wanted to start.
Yeah, sure. So for these were basically MCQ questions and more. I mean, Doug had a question right now in the chat, kind of around that some conceptual questions might be quite tricky and might actually require more than 30 seconds of time. These weren't that complicated, I would say, but maybe I'm speaking from the module lead's perspective and not from the student's perspective. If they paid attention, it wouldn't have taken them more than that time, to be honest. But again, it is probably very heterogeneous. In terms of the feedback, when they got it wrong, the tutors would actually talk about why it is wrong and what is the right answer and why it is the right answer. And not only that, they would actually go, and sometimes there are questions where if they are wrong, you actually have to go through by logic, why are the others wrong as well. So they would actually do that in classroom as well, because these are formative in each of the questions. And that would happen no matter it is untimed or timed. So that's how we kind of went through it. And it is a formative situation. So probably they actually took it more as a in-class learning rather than particularly as a feedback per se to their performance. But I don't know the answer to how they would have perceived it in terms of feedback about what were their average performance on those questions. I don't know if that answers your question exactly.
Yeah, no, it does. I think anyone else want to share any thoughts on this trade-off between getting feedback quickly and getting good quality feedback, and indeed whether it is a trade-off?
Yeah, maybe because I also answered that question. And I think for Margaret and I, the idea was really to have something automated because it was also so many students. So I think it's also a question of Margaret is actually the instructor of the class, but I did run another feedback experiment in a class that I wasn't even teaching. And so I didn't feel like I was allowed to even give more to these students. So I feel like, yeah, it is a trade-off. And for research, I think it's very hard to make it comparable once you give very personalized information. And so we work with that trade-off. Maybe Margaret wants to add something.
I mean, I've actually been quite pleased with the sort of the automated, the multiple choice style quick feedback. So whether that's using polls in the lecture or these weekly quizzes, that they get their right or wrong when the quiz closes. I find, and this is for first year students, that kind of instant feedback, even though it's very shallow feedback in a way. I mean, it's shallow, they got it right or wrong, but there is opportunities to say like why these different answers were wrong, even in a multiple choice. I think students have responded well to that compared to some other types of feedback, like longer form written feedback, which comes with more of a delay and obviously is more detailed, but also often on assignments where they're less sure of like how they're supposed to carry this forward to the next thing. But I will say that one thing that we did for this study, which was generating individualized feedback based on quantitative data from multiple choices. So we had these 9 times 5 quiz questions that we then linked to their unit, and we calculated the students' weakest performing unit, and we fed that back to them as sort of the new piece of information that they hadn't had before. I think that has potential because it is automatable, but it is also personalized. Now, the flip side of that, it was actually, I mean, it's really, what I just described is really straightforward, but actually implementing this was empirically like, I mean, the meaning was there. Like, it shouldn't, like, it's a very simple, straightforward thing to do in principle. And then you get the fact, well, what do you do if someone missed this quiz and then they did that quiz and they have 2 questions that they got from this unit, but actually there's 7, so they didn't get 2 out of 7. They didn't answer those ones, so those are missed. And then you have like harvesting all this data, and this person's got approved absence, this one just missed it. How do we count these things? It was hours of like Stata work just to get these and then to link them to the student. So even when you go, just a little, you know, we'll just twist this and get some more personalized feedback. It is a big piece of work. And this is like coming from people who work with data every day, right? So not everyone has that familiarity with manipulating data as we do. So I think it reminded me of that side of the challenge as well, that even when we're doing automated things, doing it with a little bit more sophistication does come with a really big step up of work that isn't normally workloaded and not necessarily in the skill set of everyone who's expected to do those tasks.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those ones where I certainly imagine that I'm doing it in the most inefficient manual way possible, and somebody else could be doing it in a better way. Anyone else want to add anything on this part?
I also think that feedback from continuous assessment, I have seen, because I'm using them a lot in my modules, I can see that they have a value added to the students, and because they will see and they will come back to me and will say, okay, I can understand that these are my strengths, my weaknesses, and so on, and they will ask questions, follow-up questions. What I see is that for our students, for example, we split the dissertation into 2 different modules because we wanted to give them a very detailed feedback in their literature review.
Yeah.
So they can use it for the applied part during in the second semester, basically. And to my surprise, I see that students will not see their feedback. They will see only the mark, but not the feedback. So I will have, for example, meetings in the second semester, and I will say, okay, did you read the feedback that I wrote? And I'm trying to be very constructive, their strength, so I'm spending a lot of time on providing a constructive feedback to them. And then I'm getting disappointed because they don't actually see that feedback. So in the meeting, I spent the first meeting to read the feedback. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the tricky thing. They'll look at a quiz score, but actually going back and checking the question that they didn't get right, and also the written feedback if they're happy with the grade or if they're not.
Yes, I think, yeah.
I
However, with the continuous assessment, I have seen very positive feedback from the students as well, that they like it and they are trying to improve every week based on the feedback provided. So I think my impression is it works well and is not as costly for us as well. So I don't know. Yeah.
I think it's a nice segue into Gen AI, where we're hoping Gen AI might be able to solve lots of these problems for us. If you can join me in thanking our speakers, so Margaret and Lavinia, Arpita, Courtney and Jen, and Yana and Panas. And we are going to have a 5-minute break and back at 16:30 London time, 10:30 Eastern Standard Time, and some other time in some other time zones. Thank you all, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Thank you.